We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. Well, that's the first stanza of the preamble of the Constitution. And what does it really mean that we are united in South Africa in our diversity? Well, next year will mark 20 years since the signing of the Constitution, and it seems as though that the country is more polarized than ever. Well, to help me around this discussion, I'm joined right here in studio by Reverend Frank Chikane, who's from the South African Council of Churches, as well as Mr. Stolembanga, who's from the South African Cities Network. And in Cape Town, I'm joined by Jan Hofmeyer, who's from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Jan, let's first start with you. The barometer released last week indicates that 2 out of 3 South Africans do not trust people from other races. What does that mean?
Well, indeed, what we've seen is that there is polarization along racial lines in South Africa. I think it's not a new finding, but what we have seen is that in this year's barometer, it has increased in its prominence as a source of national division. One thing that has always stood out since we've started conducting this barometer in 2003 was the question of economic inequality, but we've seen that it's more and more sort of increasingly also overlapping with the question of race, and therefore it is something that is of concern to us.
When you compare the data that you have right now from the data from the previous year, for instance, what does it indicate?
Well, what we have seen is that if we ask South Africans to identify one source of social division in South Africa, the question of inequality, in other words, the difference between rich and poor, still stands out as the most prominent schism. But we're increasingly seeing that is matched by those that are saying that racial differences still remain a very big issue for them in South Africa and remain something that divides us. We've also seen that South Africans have noted that they have very limited opportunities for contact sort of amongst each other, and therefore they also very limited opportunity to engage and to learn to understand each other as well.
But then when the barometer, the data indicates that some people are scared of or don't trust people from other races, it seems to indicate that they are scared of something. What is it that they are scared of? Did any of your respondents indicate what it is that they mistrust when it comes to other races or people from other race groups?
We've not asked them for specific sources of distrust, but I think if one looks at the findings and one looks at the frequency of interaction, one can probably also postulate that it might also have something to do with the fear of the unknown. We do not really know each other. We interact with each other in the workplace for those who have got employment. We interact in a very limited way in other sort of commercial spaces or spaces for entertainment, but we do not interact socially. We do not really understand what happens in the houses of each other, what happens in the religious context, and therefore very often I think one might say it's got to do with a fear of the unknown, really.
Reverend Chikane, does that shock you at all, that there is that level of distrust between South Africans and different race groups?
I'm not shocked at all. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made is that in 1994 we had a political reconciliation. And we assumed that if you have a political settlement, you've got peace and people who are fighting each other now talk to each other, you call that reconciliation. Yes, it is reconciliation, but it wasn't reconciliation between the people on the ground. And since then, we developed into different directions. Whites continued living their own lives. In fact, they were happy that you've got peace and they can go on with their lives. But it wasn't about sharing. It wasn't about living together. It wasn't about changing the conditions. If we tried to change the conditions, it was left for a black government to solve that problem. And so I think now, 21 years later, people realize, no, something is missing. But I must say that the churches have taken that on board. That's why we have chosen to use December 16, Day of Reconciliation, as a day for healing and reconciliation, bringing South Africans from all walks of life, blacks and whites, and in that stream also deal with the issues of reconciliation, not in terms of just personal relationships, but deal with the issues of poverty, inequality, make sure that the poor are also reconciled with the opportunities and resources of this country. So it's a different type of reconciliation. And fortunately, as fate would have it, I call it providence, that the conscript generation came and said, we want to make peace. We're conscripted, we fought a war where we didn't choose to do so. We caused harm, but 21 years later, we never have had our own peace and reconciliation commission. And therefore, we have unfinished business. And so they wanted to meet with their counterparts. We brought June 16 generation to meet twice since October. And now we have got a program that not only deals with reconciliation at a superficial level, but to say, what are whites going to do to participate in changing the conditions of life? So
but why is the question, what are whites? What are whites going to do? Why isn't it what are we, including us, black people and white people, going to do that to ensure that there's social cohesion, there is a reconciliation between the two different groups?
No, it's only that for the last 21 years, it has been, what is this black government going to do? What are we going to do? So we did whatever we needed to do, but the problem is bigger. You need all South Africans, and you need participation of whites who have not been part of that. I think that's critical. Even the national days, it becomes national days of Africans or blacks alone.
Yes.
And so we need to end that. We need, and what the conscript generation, it's a new approach. What the conscript generation is saying, they are ready to say, I'm sorry, forgive us for what we did, and we are ready to bring our skills, our resources, and our everything to rebuild a new South Africa. I met some of them today. So that our grandchildren, they are not even saying they are children. Remember, they are in their 50s now, 50s, early 60s. They are saying we want a better future for our grandchildren in this country because we have nowhere to go.
Mr. Sole, let me bring you in here. And this is actually something that was penned by Reverend Frank Chikane's colleague, Bishop Malusi Mpumulwana, who spoke about how the country remains polarized. And he breaks it down. He says, not only politically, not only economically, not only socially, but spatially as well.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Indeed, we need to understand the polarization that Bishop Mpumulwana refers to, and unfortunately I haven't read the barometer that Jan is referring to. The fact of the matter is that I think as a country we've managed to change the picture at a macro level. So we have a constitution, we have instruments that are legislation and policy that are meant to guide us as a nation, particularly this first generation of a non-racial South Africa, towards a particular direction. And there's a big difference between the theory that is held in those policies and what is happening in practice. I think academics call it praxis. And the fact of the matter, and I think as Reverend Chikane says, is that you still have people that are trapped in spaces that are yet to be transformed. So for them, if you're talking about 20 years of democracy, it becomes a bit meaningless because they still haven't changed their own living environments, whether it's through human settlements, transportation. Of course, the truth of the matter is that there has been some change. So perhaps it's not it's not sufficient. That being said, one of the things that we have noticed in the local government fraternity is that there is now the emergence of new sets of demands, which sets of demands are not necessarily articulated in these instruments, in policies and law. Where, for example, cities are becoming younger. The average size of a city, at least 50% of it, will be constituted by people that are anything between the ages of 18 and 35. They are no longer just demanding low-cost houses only or water, and they are demanding internet. So internet is becoming a right. In other words, the right to connectivity and. So all those kinds of interests are now things that are basically leapfrogging, and therefore the gap continues to be there. And I think there is testimony to that.
Do you think that the gap continues to be there? Because if you look, for instance, at, let's say, government policy around where do we build an RDP house, for instance, and I remember the former Minister of Human Settlements, Toko Sugole, had indicated that what should actually happen is that we should have a situation where you have an RDP house, for instance, in Sandton, if that is possible, so that we ensure that there is that social cohesion and that interaction between the poor, which is predominantly black, as well as the white, predominantly rich.
Well, let's put it like this. Black people need white people. White people need black people. That's from a point of view of race. Similarly, from an economic point of view, rich people can never live alone. They need people that are poor people that are looking for those jobs. And vice versa, poor people are looking for rich people in order for them to be able to provide jobs. So the bottom line is that we need each other. So if that is the case, we cannot continue to be located separately. We have to be located in close proximity to each other precisely because of the fact that we need each other. Now, it's quite important from a spatial transformation point of view that one of the things that you do is to engage in spatial transformation. In other words, as you say, get people to live close to their places of work, get people to play close to their places where they stay. In that way, you achieve a new society, the non-racial society that the Freedom Charter dreamt of. You are able to physically and practically do that. And in that way, then people get to know each other. And I think as Jan is saying, the problem here is that there is limited physical interaction between people that were divided by apartheid. And we need to create physical spaces that facilitate that interaction between races, between classes, and between generally everyone who lives in South Africa.
Jan, let me bring you in here. On this, the data that we have here in front of us from the barometer, the survey, inequality tops the list of reasons why we have the social divisions that we're currently experiencing. Was there an indication why this is happening? Because I've realized from the other data as well that white people, most of them feel that you don't need to deal with poverty to ensure that there is social cohesion and integration between the different race groups.
Yeah, no, that is correct. It's in successive surveys we've seen that people have identified inequality as the primary source of division. But interestingly also, whereas we have seen that the majority of South Africans have indicated a sort of a high percentage of distrust towards other racial groups. The interesting thing is that the majority of South Africans, about 60%, still say that we need to pursue national reconciliation as a national objective. But the proviso there is that they say that, and again a majority of South Africans say that national reconciliation is not possible or will be impossible if we do not address the question of material inequality. So, whereas we may have made progress along the line, this may be stunted or halted if we do not make any progress in addressing the question of inequality.
Reverend Chikane, as somebody who's worked in the government, you've worked with former President Nelson Mandela, you've also worked with the former President Thabo Mbeki as well. Do you think that the policies that we currently have, like for instance BEE, would be able to level the playing field when it comes to inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor?
Lots of work has been done. Fantastic policies have been developed to try to deal with this inequality, poverty, exclusion of the majority of blacks from the economy. But I still say that as long as if not all South Africans participate to solve this problem, it's impossible to solve it. And I keep on saying, maybe we should have had a permanent government of national unity where blacks and whites worked together, bring all the resources together, make sure that we invest money where we can create valuable economic activity, create jobs, create entrepreneurs, and black empowerment on its own falls far from dealing with all these challenges we are facing. And I'm convinced than ever before that we need big business, small business, we need whites, blacks, we need all the skills that we can have. We need to capacitate black young people to participate in the economy fully. The only future and security for this country is to get rid of the gap of inequality where you've got very poor people and very rich people. That's a recipe for disaster.
And I guess the other issue is, how do you bring blacks and whites together when you have a report like this that indicates that 2 out of 3 South Africans don't trust people from other races? How do you make sure that there is that level of trust, that as a fellow South African, I can work with you as a fellow white South African?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the churches were part of the problem in history. But you know, both whites and blacks belong to the churches, the majority of people of this country. Churches should have played a better role. But I am saying now that I have hope. The journey we are following now into the future will be better than yesterday. The new movement of the conscript generation and the June 16 students, which is being broadened to all the generations, is to mobilize blacks and whites together, let them work together. They've already been in Soweto together already during October, November. And between now and December next year, we're going to work together, mobilize the country, bring whites and blacks together, work together in programs to change the economic conditions of people up to June 16. June 16 is 40th anniversary next year. We're going to use that as a basis where blacks and whites will come together and say, we had a horrible history, we are now ready to fix it. And by December next year, we'll be together with the South Africa of promise that we really fought for and struggled for. And that's what the program is all about. I believe next year, at this point, we'll be talking a different language.
Is this the program that will be launched at Regina Mundi?
Yeah,
is that part
Sunday,
of it?
Yeah, on Sunday. The churches have done See, Judge, Act. We have analyzed the conditions in the country, the problems, and we decided we must deal with poverty and inequality. There's a program that's ward by ward, family by family, one family at a time. We're going to start that program now. We also deal with economic transformation. We're focused on family fabric because the family has also been broken down. I mean, we've got broken families. The children grow up in conditions that are not conducive. And we are also dealing with the issues of democracy and deepening our democracy, making sure that there is peace. And that's what we're going to launch on the 16th, on Wednesday. And that program will then start working through June 16 into December next year.
Mr. Stolle, what this barometer also indicates, and still keeping on the subject around economic participation of both black and whites, is that it sort of indicates that the lower LSM has less interaction with other race groups compared to like the highest LSM 8 to 10. Is that also an issue that you find in cities compared to a rural area, for instance, that in a rural area, let's say somewhere in Venda, there's less interaction between different race groups compared to what's happening here in Gauteng?
Okay, I'm sure there are regional nuances and dynamics that that will be different from one area to the other. But I think the central concern that there is lack of trust between races in South Africa 20 years later, 20 years into democracy, is what should primarily concern us. Obviously, I think the way in which that mistrust will articulate itself will differ within even one area, say even in the metropolitan, cosmopolitan areas. You'll still find those nuances. I go back to the point that I made earlier, that it is those people that do not have access to jobs. It is those people that are still trapped in spaces for the last 20 years.
And it's not that they don't want to interact.
I don't think it's that they do not want to act. I think there are other people that are exhausted, just sheer exhaustion from being unable to secure jobs. So I agree, and I think we need to commend what the religious community is doing. Number one, I mean, you need pro-poor economic development. That pro-poor economic development will uplift a huge section of our community to make sure that they are then able to interact. Secondly, that pro-poor economic, it's going to lead to revenues. I mean, for instance, us in municipalities, we rely very much on revenues. We've said a couple of times that city services or municipal services are becoming unaffordable. They're becoming unaffordable because households have high unemployment rates. Within a household, you can find that there's no one that is there's no one that is employed, and therefore they are unable to afford municipal services. That alienates people from those that are able to afford, and suddenly creates the gap between those that have and those that do not have. And then it sows the divisions then between society, sometimes expressing itself in class, sometimes it's expressing itself in racialistic terms. So I agree, we need to create pro-poor economic growth that will lead to jobs that are targeting poor people, because that will also then lead to revenue. And then suddenly, I mean, things will change. So I believe the economy is a very important factor in finding the solution towards creating a non-racial society.
Reverend Chikana, we find ourselves commemorating this day, Reconciliation Day, because of what happened in the past. And you have personally suffered as well. How did you find that solace to say, do you know what? I'm willing to forgive. I'm willing to say, let's build a better South Africa.
You know, I've been saying that before, but I'm surprised about the conscript generation saying the same and June 16 generation saying the same. The point is, we have a horrible past. It has caused damage to us, not only physically, but even mentally. It has affected people's way of thinking. But, you know, we have to accept that you can't do much about that which has happened in the past. We can do something about that which is in the future. And I always say, I refuse to let the past arrest the future and rob me of a better future. Indeed, you must recognize the past. We can't forget. I mean, I've got a back pain that comes from torture and detention. But, you know, I mean, yeah, but I mustn't be focusing on that and then kill the future, to use this word kill in a special way. We need to build a new South Africa, and the last 20 years, we've tried our best. Clearly, the barometer results tells you that something is still missing. And that's what we need to deal with now. Change the socio-economic conditions of our people. I
was actually going to ask you that on your personal experience, that is, when you're done taking a shower, done taking a bath, and you look at the Frank Chikane in the mirror, and you look at all the marks and the scars that you have, how do you do it? How do you say, it's okay. It's okay what they've done, I forgive them, while I have these marks on my body that tell a story?
There are people who have got worse marks than myself. They've lost limbs and, you know, worse conditions. No, it's not okay. I wouldn't use the word okay. It's not okay that I've got a damage in my body. But I am saying we need to make peace, reconcile, but not only reconcile, build a new South Africa, do it together. What was absent in the past is that it is those who are victims who are trying to build this new society. And I'm saying no. We can't do it alone. We need to do it together. And there are now whites in this country who are determined to come to the party. And I believe the future is going to be different. And now this is grassroots activity. See, in the past, we also depended on leaders and governments, and we thought it will happen at that level. It must happen at a grassroots level.
Jan, let's bring you in here. The barometer also looking into the foundation, whether some respondents believe that the TRC has created the perfect foundation to start this discussion around reconciliation and harness reconciliation. From the respondents that you've spoken to, are there those who believe that, you know what, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just another activity? It hasn't really gotten to the core issues that have affected South Africans.
Yes, of course. In our survey, about 60% of respondents indicated that they believe that the TRC provided the necessary foundation for reconciliation to take place in South Africa. But there is 40% more of respondents who indicated otherwise. And I think also with the benefit of hindsight as South Africans, we've also identified some of the shortcomings of the TRC, particularly in terms of the period that it covered and also the mandate itself. But I think the important thing about the TRC, although it could not address as many individual cases as possible, I think it dispelled the narrative that these atrocities did not happen. I think there are no South Africans that can say that apartheid was not a crime against humanity, that these atrocities were not committed.
Reverend Chikane, just in closing, what do you say to South Africans who still fly the old South African flag, who still believe that South Africa is better under a white government, who still believe that there is no space for us as black and white to live together in this country?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, there will always be fringe elements like that. In any society, there would be people who think in a strange way. But I want to believe that the majority of whites in this country don't think like that and should not think like that. They should understand that the future only is where we are together into the future. There's no other way. And that's why we have committed ourselves not only to work towards, but you'll see in the theme of the South African Council of Churches, we say the South Africa we pray for. But we don't pray for only, we plan, we act, and we believe that God will help us to bring that type of South Africa where people can live together in peace and be productive and be happy. South Africa must be the best place for anybody to be in. And I would say to those who are in that place, that they need to interact more with others. The world is not in isolation alone.
Mr. Stoller, the South Africa that we pray for is an inclusive South Africa that accepts that all who live in it belong here. They have a place here in South Africa. And with the cities, unfortunately, it seems as though it's becoming really tense with more and more foreign nationals coming through. And we saw earlier this year the xenophobic attacks happening in Durban and spread over to other metropolitan areas as well.
Well, to that, I will say we just have to look to the African Union. I mean, it has Vision 2063, and it talks about the Africa we want. So it's everything more about action. As I said, I mean, it's about moving away from the foundations and the trenches of theory and moving practically. I would say to anyone who still thinks that anyone who differs from yourself, either racially or by place of origin, there's nothing wrong. In fact, cities are built by migration inward, because cities tend to be an important point of melt point in which people bring their different innovation, and the city has to be able to harness that innovation, and then it will lead to economic development. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to the guests who've joined me here today. We have Jan Hofmeyr, who is from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, who joined us all the way from Cape Town. And right here in studio, I was joined by Reverend Frank Chikane from the South African Council of Churches, as well as Mr. Stolembanga from the South African Cities Network. Well, the issue right now is what happens at home. Do you guys have that discussion at the dinner table? Do you have the discussion at a braai as well? And when you are sitting at your social gatherings, do you ask yourself, what is it that divides South Africa and what is it that can unite us? Well, the government theme is economic freedom in our lifetime. Will that happen? Is that the common goal that all South Africans should be really pushing towards heading into the future and making sure that our constitution reigns supreme?